Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm sure you've been had a long day of talking and or listening in front of with this conference. So thanks for joining at the end of the day with me. Like April said, my name is Kristen Castry. I'm from A Place at the Table. Some of you may know A Place at the Table as a documentary film about hunger in America that came out in 2013. A Place at the Table, the organization, was founded after the film was released to continue the message of the film, to spread it to a wider audience in new and creative and innovative ways, and to work with the anti-hunger community on new ways to shift the public perception of hunger, their understanding of root causes, their understanding of its solvability, and to inspire them to action. And so the presentation that we'll be going through today is called Shifting Perspectives on Hungers. And I'm just going to share my screen right now because I just want to talk about the title. And then we'll go from there. Okay, first, just one quick sec. One sec, sorry, excuse me. Oops, I guess I need to do this first. And there we go. Does that look okay, April?
That looks great.
Great. So this, I want to make sure that it's not going automatically. Okay, good. This playbook is called Shifting Perspectives on Hunger, and you can kind of read that title a couple of different ways. One way would be that, perspectives on hunger are shifting as time goes on and as society changes. But the way that we really mean it here is, how do we as a community and as anti-hunger professionals and people who work in this space and are part of the communities where hunger exists, how do we all actively work to do the shifting? And so this presentation is really about some of the insights that we gleaned from a 2018 research project we did with Frameworks Institute, which is a think tank that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But in terms of agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research from which this playbook was derived. And but first, before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about why this kind of active frame shifting of perceptions of hunger is important, and why there's an especially important opportunity right now for us to do that together. And what some of the we're going to talk about what some of the frames are, mental mindsets that Americans have baked into their psyche that prevent them from viewing hunger, its root causes, and its solvability the way that we think would advance long-term systemic change. And we're going to pause a couple of times as we go through the recommendations and the insights for you to ask questions and discuss how they might be useful or not useful. Please, when we have those moments to stop and talk, and at the end when we have Q&A, it would be, I'd love to hear how you find it useful, but it's really useful for you to kind of kick the tires on some of this thinking and tell me what's difficult about it, or what kinds of ways you think it might not be useful, because it took quite a while for us to really get our head around this, because it's not all of it is 100% intuitive. And so, but we came to the end of the process and really found that these insights were pretty invaluable, and as they've been put into practice, we found that they they're proven by research. So we do find that they have value, but not every single insight necessarily might be valuable to every single organization or person. So, but I do want to hear your pushback. This playbook was, but the original research was, we would just like to thank the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in Annenberg and the Angel Foundations for helping to make that possible. Our gratitude goes out to all of you who work in this space and are part of this, who work every day to alleviate the impact of poverty and advocate for systems change and devote themselves to creating a more just future, and also work in the emergency relief space right now. I'm sure that everyone has had a very heart-wrenching year. And I'd also like to thank the folks, some of whom may be on this call, who inputted into this playbook to try to make the research as sort of usable as possible. And that would be Minerva Delgado, who we all know, I'm sure, Jake Claro and Sarah Danley from Vermont Farm to Plate, Mark Jacobson from Hunger Free Colorado, Chris Ford from Bread for the World, and Lisa Fernandez from the UNH Sustainability Institute. Okay, so setting the table. We all know that America's hunger problem is vast and deep and relentlessly perpetuated by poverty. The organizations on the front lines fighting this issue have worked for decades to address the root causes, but the problem persists. And, we felt like it was really, really important to talk about right at the start how connected to structural racism as a root cause of hunger is. Not all of the recommendations are about helping the public to understand the way that structural racism contributes to poverty and hunger, but most of them do. We think it's a real opportunity for anti-hunger organizations to take the lead role in communicating how historical racism impacts poverty in America as one of their most important objectives. And we think that really what this playbook is meant to do is to help draw a line and to start to paint a picture of how a narrative shift through every way that an organization communicates can help to destigmatize hunger and make space for human dignity, rather than allowing some of the general public to sometimes subconsciously assign blame to those who are already suffering. We believe it's a core need of the current movement to end hunger, to talk about solutions focused on impacting systemic change. And that is what ultimately we think will help shift what hunger looks like across America, over the next 10 years, 20 years. Also, I just wanted to read this quote from the National Alliance of Hunger Organizations. They put out a statement earlier on in the year after the death of George Floyd and the subsequent protests. And I thought it was a really great encapsulation of some of what I was talking about in terms of structural racism that we want to help people, the general public, connect the dots on a bit. For decades, communities of color have faced structural barriers, and as a result, their white counterparts are more advantaged in employment, income, and education. COVID-19 has exacerbated these disparities with African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans experiencing higher death rates, food insecurity, and loss of employment. The clear connections between race, wealth, and health are unavoidable and unacceptable. So who's at the table? So how did this come to be? We talked a little bit about a place at the table. Frameworks Institute, that did the original research, is a nonprofit think tank that advances the mission-driven sector's capacity to frame the public discourse about social and scientific issues. So they have worked on a number of different issues, including issues connected to poverty, including climate change, including opioid addiction. And so, after this, you'll be able to access the original messaging brief that came from the research. But I also encourage everyone to check out their website, because there's lots of interesting research they've done on adjacent issues or other issues that you might want to check out. So they design, conduct, and public multi-method, multidisciplinary framing research among the public. And then they also have a team of linguistics experts and semiotics experts and people who help frame the message frames, and they test to see how people think about an issue, how we as experts would want them to think about the issue, and what kinds of framing devices shift their narrative in their cultural mindset from point A to point B. But really, the most important person in this conversation is you all and the people that you work with. And that's why when we got the original messaging brief, which you'll have access to, we also wanted to create this playbook, because the original message brief is like this 20-page report, and it's very interesting, but it takes a bit of time, and it's not quite set up to be discussed as an organization. So we created this to help foster discussion within organizations. And so our hope is that you would take this back to your colleagues if you found some useful nuggets, and to start a conversation. And any time we are available to help facilitate that, and we're actually also doing that in partnership with frameworks as well, and to start to talk about what are kind of the specific ways an organization could put this into action. And it's really not a one size fits all. It's really kind of depends on how you communicate, where you communicate, what your most important ways you communicate are. In addition, who you choose to partner with, what you say to legislative allies, how you ask for support from the public, and all those things play a role in the way that the public discourse at large is set, and how minds are shifted, and the social change that manifests as a result. You can use this information to help create a broader understanding of hunger that emphasizes its collective and systemic nature, and open hearts and minds to real approaches that will end hunger. So at the moment, the public, thankfully, is opening their wallets and wants to be able to provide funding for emergency food relief. Not enough, but that's totally needed, and it's great that the public has a really keen understanding of what's happening hunger-wise at the moment. I mean, maybe not really keen, but they have some understanding of what's happening in a way they didn't maybe a year ago. But we also would love to see more organizations talking about the kind of long-term systemic change that would compel a member of the public to call their member of Congress and ask for longer-term solutions that are comprehensive and systemic. Just to take it to this moment now. So the research was done in 2018. We put together this playbook with a company called Purpose earlier on in the year, and it was just as the pandemic hit. And as it happens, the pandemic, as I think most people would agree, it has certainly exposed the fragility and the gaps in the systems and the safety nets designed to support Americans in times of need. And also the attention on the nationwide Black Lives Matter protests have, given the historic and systemic racism embedded in our society has been a little more talked about in the media, and that has provided an opportunity, we think, to take that ball and run with it, and really start to have people see where systemic racism exists where they didn't see it before necessarily. Certainly many people who experience systemic racism will see it a lot more clearly than many others. The research in context, this is like, before the pandemic, 1 in 8 Americans do not have access to nutritious food because of economic or geographic reasons. you know, we define hunger as the lack of nutritious food and believe that it's systemic factors that cause the problems, that causes this problem. So this is certainly information you all would be aware of. Let's note that. So the frameworks research is, the objective was to arrive at a set of framing tools and tactics that advocates can use with confidence. They designed a series of quantitative experiments that tested the effects of different frame elements on communicating expert perspectives on hunger. The frame elements included different ways of using values, explanatory metaphors, and narratives. And then to determine the effects of the frames, researchers created short messages that incorporated one or more frame elements. From a large nationally representative sample of US residents, a survey experiment randomly assigned participants to different messages. So, you know, more visually, you know, they took a sample of people, they randomly assigned them messages to test, they compared them, they compared the outcomes of each of these messages and decided, you know, what are the kinds of messages that most effectively shifted people towards a systemic understanding. And then they went back and did it again until they could refine the messages to work as well as they could. And we talked a little bit about, I'm going to skip this page. There's a lot more. This is really longer than an hour presentation. So I'm going to skip this, but you certainly know how coronavirus has shifted the narrative. So the purpose of this playbook is to understand the existing harmful frames that drive the current thinking about hunger, utilize research-vetted frames and language to increase support around hunger, and identify and promote ways for your organization to shift current messaging and language that might perpetuate harmful frames. So some examples of how this has worked in the past, if you think about when gay marriage migrated to marriage equality, that very small narrative shift and linguistic shift, while is not the sole reason that the marriage equality has been accepted at the level it has in a short period of time. It went from not receiving favor by the public to receiving overwhelming favor by the public. Part of that has to do with that linguistic shift. And it didn't happen kind of by accident. It happened because advocates came upon that through research and discussion. And another example is like the word litter bugs. Like it was when the Make America Beautiful campaign came out in the 1960s, or I think in the 1960s. There are a few different stories about how the word litter bug came to be, but one story is that it was an advertising agency that was working with the Ad Council on the Keep America Beautiful, but then there's some other people who have to claim credit, but that just little word helped encapsulate really what it meant to be someone who throws their candy wrappers on the ground or throws their can out the window, and which was a completely normal thing to do in the 50s and 60s. And now you never imagine doing that. No one would imagine doing that. So those are a couple of good examples that we almost don't really think about. Okay, good. Let's see. Okay. So we're starting from the premise that hunger is systemic, intersectional, and solvable. It's the far-reaching impact of hunger is best understood across issue spaces when its intersectional nature is elevated and metaphors that create a clear understanding of hunger are used. And in general, they found that hunger is normally talked about as in sort of a silo. It's not necessarily always talked about in connection to poverty. It's not always talked about in connection to low wages. It's not always connected to issues of systemic racism. It's not always connected to issues of public health or education or early childhood development, and all of those issues that people bring other kinds of ideas about as they listen to information about them. It can be really helpful to connect those things. So how to draw those connections and not allow hunger to be in its own silo is really helpful, and some of these recommendations will help you do if you don't already. So what are the things that impedes Americans' understanding of hunger? Well, for one, even if it's in a very deeply subconscious way, many Americans still view hunger as a personal problem. Many Americans still try to make sense of the issue through beliefs framed around personal blame and laziness. And being that systemic hunger is a systemic issue, it must be tackled holistically. And our challenge isn't to highlight brokenness but to inspire solutions. Any messaging around hunger should center on the dignity of experience as a core value. So here are a few of the unhelpful beliefs that the American public has deeply baked in, that has to do with, our narrative around the American dream and some of the flawed ways we talk about American history and what it means to be American, that have kind of gone in a direction that has made some of these conversations more difficult. And so this is a chart from Frameworks that they use in a lot of different conversations about issues around poverty, because they're applicable in lots of different, when you're having lots of different kinds of conversations. So for example, the idea of individualism, that, in America, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. The idea of mentalism is that, bad personal choices are the result of a lack of discipline, that if you have willpower and discipline, then you're able to make better choices, and that's the result of your life. There's also the balanced budget idea, which is people are hungry because they do not manage their money well. And so that's why one of the reasons why you'll see a little bit later, when we talk about hunger, sometimes when we talk about the economics of hunger, we're really trying to pull it up to a more macro 30,000 foot view, as opposed to inviting people to possibly think, well, think through what an individual's personal budget would be and how they would do it differently. Because that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets you right down into a judgment zone. And we want people to be thinking at a much higher level as a community and as a society, and what our responsibilities are from that point of view. There is confusing terminology. Terms like food insecurity, while everyone here, I'm sure, is very familiar with what that means, and in this kind of context, it makes a lot of sense, but it can be confusing to people who don't know, aren't in the weeds, and so they generally found that hunger is the term, while imperfect, is the best one to use when you're talking to the public generally. And then there's also the charity mindset. Hunger is the idea that hunger is a personal issue and it's solvable by personal charity. And if you want to make an impact on it, the best thing to do is just to give money and to give food and do food drives, and that will get you, that's really taking care of the problem. And, as we know, while those things are crucial, they're not taking care of the problem for, the short or the long term. So this is kind of the top line of the recommendations. The first is to define and say the word hunger in the US context. One of the phrases that Frameworks uses a lot is explain, explain, explain. What seems obvious to people who are, on the front lines every day is not obvious to the general public. So a lot of the explaining in its US context has to do with explaining how it's possible that we can have a hunger problem and an obesity problem, and not really like avoiding that conversations, but going right to it to say, we have hunger and we have obesity because they're two sides of the same coin in this country, and we have a food system which makes it possible for unhealthy food to be really, really cheap in relation to healthy food, which is really, really expensive, and that the system's out of whack. And if our leaders were able to make that a priority, that's one way we could address the issue. Number two is the food ecosystem metaphor, and we're going to talk a little bit about the metaphors, and I'll read them specifically. The food ecosystem metaphor is really the way they found was most effective to talk about the socioeconomic determinants of hunger, and socioeconomic determinants of hunger. So as opposed to the power grid metaphor, which is really more about the geographic determinants of hunger. And so we'll talk a little more about that in a sec. And then the fourth is to combat negative stereotypes of people who experience hunger by broadening the public's understanding of who is hungry. And we'll talk a little bit, that's a tricky one, because while you really want to combat the idea that a hungry person looks like this, that a hungry person must be homeless, that a hungry person couldn't be employed, or a hungry person XYZ. So the trick is to, if you are showing individual stories, which can be really powerful, as we know, showing as many different kinds of stories as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So with many different racial identities and many different ages, and not just showing like one kind of person. And so first, always define and say hunger. They found, and we talked a little bit about this, that food insecurity can often mean, people can go to a place of like thinking it's about guilt over food choices, or trouble sticking to a diet, or eating disorders. It has a lot of things that people do not associate it with, with poverty and hunger. So it's really important to talk about the quality and the quantity of food when we're talking about hunger. And the way that our government defines what a healthy diet is still really quite outdated. And so that definitely updating the nutritional standards for things like school lunch, and the general population's nutritional standards, getting away from some of the conversations about calorie count versus the quality and quantity of food together, would go a long way towards that. But in terms of individual organizations, providing a more robust explanation of what healthy really means would help. So on the next page, we've got, on the next page, we've got kind of like an example of what you could say and what would be maybe a better way to say it. So you could say 1 in 8 Americans are food insecure, but another way to say that would be 1 in Americans don't get enough healthy food. You could say, here's a list of food assistance programs. So a lot of, organizations will say, look at all of these. There's SNAP, there's WIC, there's this program and that program, all great and important that people can take advantage of and should. But sometimes without the context on a website, for example, saying, good programs are essential and here are some good programs, but they alone are insufficient in ending hunger. They are underfunded, and we need a longer term national priority to end hunger. To reinforce that message at every opportunity really, really helps. Another is some geographies are food deserts, and instead you can say food is unequally distributed. You know, food is, so for example, because food deserts, that language, while it's useful in some ways, I find it useful, they actually found that, you know, the language of a desert is tricky because deserts in real life, like a desert doesn't have any people in it, or well, it has some people in it, but it's not very populated. Deserts, you can't do anything about a desert. The desert is not solvable. It's a fixed natural phenomenon, and so people, it's when we use language that reinforces the permanence of hunger, it's problematic. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to talk about the power grid metaphor in a sec. And you could say people who are experiencing hunger are not lazy, they're good people. Instead of saying that, which is problematic on its face, you could say, you know, all types of people experience hunger when the food systems are out of balance. And that idea of being out of balance and using the out of balance language is really comes up a lot in the research. So I wanted to take just a quick second to stop here and see, you know, how are there ways that you're currently communicating about hunger, and if you think there is room to make a change, or any of these, you know, messaging recommendations feeling relevant to the work that you do. And, you know, are there audiences of people be within or outside of your organization that you think you could kind of influence? So if you want, I can't actually see the chat while I'm in the sharing my screen. So wait, no, I guess I can. Okay, let's see. Let me just stop for a quick sec. And just see, are there any questions here? I see, and if you asked a question or have a comment, if you might be able to unmute yourself. And
there's what's being called a moment of reckoning happening.
Sorry,
a reckoning not simply with white supremacy and the.
Sorry. So if is anyone, I see Amber to everyone. Let's see.
Amber. I didn't have any questions. I just put some resources up as you were talking.
Oh, thank you. Do you want to talk about those resources for a sec?
You know, for me, it comes from being Native and raising multiracial kids and being aware of the food forests. I mean, you know, the disparities and stuff like that, and the food deserts of Pine Ridge. You know, a lot of times BIPOC people are used as models for the different advertisements for hunger. You know, here's the face of hunger. You know, changing some of that, changing the perception of help. Okay, when you say help, you're putting yourself higher than another person. And the thing is, a lot of people that are in these situations had land stolen, have the historical trauma, haven't been denied access to equal opportunity. If you have a person that's renting, they're paying more for rent than they would for a mortgage, but they're not able to, you know, access those resources. So reframing it as knowledge or lived experience rich and resource poor, and where it's mutual aid because we're helping one another. And I think just kind of changing, you know, perceptions of teaching people to fish. That's one of the principles for church. Okay, when you're having food banks, you're not teaching them to fish. You're not teaching them to be sovereign and food sovereign and grow their own food and be able to network with community and use soups instead of the typical, you know, meals that are, you know, the soup, the salad, the main dishes and stuff like that, that wastes a lot of food. And getting organizations like, you know, to not just use donations as a way to sidestep the issue. They're making money off of hunger, okay? And then they're giving pennies back to the actual community. So in my community, there's an organization that helps homeless people. Their operating budget for 2 years would actually, for 1 year, would house everybody for 2 years. And so the nonprofits are kind of using that to their own individual advantage, and the direct needs for the people are not being addressed. Whereas if you had community gardens and not now, but community kitchens where you teach canning and preserving and eating around the cycles and the seasons, and having those, bread makes people hungry. I had cancer. And so first thing they said is no gluten and no dairy. Well, after I eliminated all that stuff from my diet, when I had Wonder Bread, I was hungry and ate 5 times more that day. And so, but what's available at food banks is bread, you know, and dairy that makes most people sick, you know. So really expanding that circle as everybody being equal. Everybody has gifts to bring to that table.
Agree. And Amber, I really like what you said about the language of help. That word specifically wasn't part of the research, but one of the things they do talk about is the frequency with which we sometimes use the word vulnerable or vulnerable populations. And I think, the research bore out that has a similar impact on people. The way people think is it's sort of creates a hierarchical way of looking at the situation. Like, there are these people who are at another level that need help and are vulnerable, and that it's really degrading, but it doesn't sound like that when you're saying it. They're so used to using that word. But their recommendation is to, you know, if you really want to speak about people with and individuals with maximum dignity, the word vulnerable can be problematic, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's more about respect, and then responsibility and reciprocity. That's a huge one that's not looked at, because when people volunteer at food banks or do different things, they feel better and they actually get more from the work that they do than that is actually like acknowledged kind of in the big, you know, big picture. You know, they receive more than they are giving. And I think that focus on that reciprocity would be huge, that just the shift. Because COVID didn't impact me. Because my elders, I was at Standing Rock, said, be prepared for no grocery stores, no running water, and no electricity. And I'm like, okay, so for the last couple of years, we've been you know, kind of planning for that, learning to grow more food indoors, even sweet potatoes, growing herbs. I have a patio garden, you know, because I live in an apartment. And just been saving things that are in sale that are more shelf stable and healthy. And so I didn't even have to go out. I have enough food for a couple of years, and, you know, getting the extra SNAP benefits was helpful. And I was able to help other people in my community. But kind of having that mindset, because I was trained, you know, by the elders, and to be able to make those soups and stews and have networks and community. And not have to feel like that I'm out there alone. And I think the big focus has been everybody has to be every man for himself, versus actually taking a leap of faith. Instead of neighborhood watch, it should be neighborhood connect with your neighbors, connect with your elders in your community, have these multi-generational spaces, because we have the great law of peace, and we have the ancestor indigenous knowledge of how to live in harmony as equal, if we're willing to look backwards to move ahead.
Thanks, Amber. That's really helpful. I'm just going to go on to the next slide and the next insight that we can talk about. There we go. Okay, so the ecosystem metaphor, you know, use the ecosystem metaphor, we say, when it works, because this one's a little tricky one sometimes. Comparing hunger to an ecosystem can help people recognize how other social factors contribute to hunger, like structural inequality, inequity, low wages, and high costs of living. And these factors can impact which neighborhoods get quality food and how affordable they might be. It might be. You know, and the research found that people who see hunger through the ecosystem metaphor can better understand the intersectionality of hunger, and were less likely to describe hunger as a result of individuals' choices and more likely to describe it as a result of a lack of affordable food. So what is the ecosystem metaphor? So here's are two different kind of explanations, and how a more traditional explanation would be altered by the ecosystem lens. So the original one is: the Farm Bill is the centerpiece of federal legislation for food and farming, and it impacts access to nutritious food for the millions of American families struggling with hunger. One of the priority programs to protect is SNAP. The supplemental SNAP is the cornerstone federal program to help hardworking families during difficult times. Serving more than 43 million Americans, SNAP is the largest anti-hunger program in the United States. So another way to do this is, you know, comparing the need for SNAP to imbalances in the ecosystem, like as a systemic problem and not one of personal choices. So, you know, the Farm Bill is the major piece of legislation that reshapes our food ecosystem. It offers a chance to restore balance to parts of the system that have been disrupted, like the disconnect between rising food costs and stagnant wages. Government programs that subsidize food purchases like SNAP have been successful in restoring access to healthy food. So some of the most important points are bolded here. You know, a family's benefit would see it a shift from less nutritious foods like bread or potatoes to healthier items that cost just a bit more, like tomatoes and carrots. So we're gonna skip, just for the purposes of time, skip this reflection and go on to the next one, and then we'll do it after the grid metaphor. Okay, the power grid metaphor is really more about how can we more effectively talk about the geographic dynamics of hunger. And so we can use the power grid to help people understand the geographic barriers of accessing affordable, healthy food. So the comparison helps people see that food isn't distributed equally to all parts of the country, and that people who live in areas with patchy food coverage face difficulty getting healthy food, and that can be in a more urban environment or in a rural environment. So here's a comparison. So the first is using like the food desert language. The term food desert refers to geographic areas where people have limited access to healthy food, a problem that affects millions of Americans every year. These areas tend to have concentrations of low income and minority residents, invoking socioeconomic and racial divides. Washington, D.C. has a 6.5 square miles of food deserts overall, about 11% of the city's total area. Areas including historic Anacostia, Berry Farms, Mayfair, and Ivy City contain the majority of food deserts found in the city. So a better way would be to compare the hunger experience to the power grid to help people understand the geographic causes of hunger and to suppress patterns of thinking that blame individuals. So in that instance, you'd say something like, just as our city's power grid delivers electricity to every neighborhood, our food systems should connect every community to the healthy food it needs. Right now, there are areas where this grid doesn't reach, locations where it's difficult to get to a grocery store that sells fresh produce. In fact, about 11% of DC's total area has patchy access to the food grid. Most residents in these disconnected neighborhoods are lower income and people of color. We should expand and strengthen the network that supplies the most basic source of energy, good food. So I'm wondering if we can leave the share for a minute, if there's any folks that have any reactions to these two metaphors or ideas for how they might be implemented in like real life. And if you want, you can write it in the chat. Okay, I see. I'm just going to read Amanda's note. I'm curious what kind of opportunity APAT sees in engaging the broadening population that is newly food insecure as a result of COVID. Well, you know, it's true. I mean, the most important population to engage certainly are people who are experiencing hunger, and that has always been the case. And I agree that the biggest opportunity would be to engage the people who are newly hungry and who were just one disaster away from from having trouble putting food on the table. And they probably were, on that tipping point for probably a while before, maybe. And telling I think the best way would be if those people, the people who are willing, would be able to, talk about their experience and be able to get a really broad range of stories. That would be the best way. And from our point of view, we work more in the, media and storytelling landscape. So that would be our recommendation for other organizations, if they can add that to their list. It's hard right now, I know. Well, if there are any other thoughts about those two metaphors or anything else, please pop them in the chat, and we'll keep on rolling for now. And feel free to unmute yourself if you would like, when we have our little stops. And this is really about what we were just talking about, elevating diverse and reframed stories that don't perpetuate stereotypes. And so here are two different stories told two different ways. One, and they're both about Anita. And the first would be a more traditional way. Right now in America, over 41 million people in the US, 1 in 8 experience hunger, which they aren't able to get enough food, or they aren't able to get enough healthy food. Anita is one of those people. She's homeless and depends on the generosity of strangers, food banks, and government assistance to get by. Each month, she receives a small amount of money towards groceries from SNAP. But because food banks can't always help her and SNAP benefits are low, she can't afford enough healthy food. But you could tell a story about someone who is different, and also tell the story of the homeless Anita. But maybe there's another person who is, Anita is a parent of 2 children. She works a minimum wage job. Each month she receives a small amount of money towards groceries for her family from SNAP, but because her job does not pay well and SNAP benefits are low, her family frequently cannot afford enough healthy food. And so we paint a picture of what it means, what SNAP really does right now, which is it supplements, but it doesn't solve the problem. And what would happen if we thought about this issue more holistically and also funded the programs that work like SNAP the way they should be funded. And I would say, also, a lot of organizations talk a lot about children, and that's understandable because no one can stomach the idea of a child going hungry, and it tends to have the impact of getting more donations in, which is understandable. It gets a reaction, it gets an emotional reaction. But the research found that it's really important, not only to focus on children and families, but also make sure that we're talking about the elderly, make sure we're talking about LGBTQ folks, talking about the disproportionate number of people of color who experience food insecurity, college students, and the able-bodied adult male. Because if it's us that's saying every single person deserves to be able to earn the money for themselves and their family to be able to eat properly, then the public will take the lead. It's just that those stories aren't presented always that way, and so it's worth thinking about how we could do that. And let's see. So some questions to think about for reflection, and feel free to pop some things in the chat. You know, how would you communicate the key differences between the you could and the you should narratives? And are there personal stories about hunger that have subverted your own understanding of whose impact? Probably have a lot of those stories recently. Is there enough diversity in the leadership ranks of your organization to help ensure input from a variety of personal experiences? And are there a couple of things about your organization that you can do to shift how stories are told about people experiencing hunger? And so I wanted to go just onto, before we've got about 7 minutes, so I want to leave 5 minutes for a little more conversations. You know, this page has, you know, just a summary of some of the things from the takeaway of just these insights. There's a lot more information in the brief itself, but it was hard to talk about everything. This, at the end, we've got a few examples in action of imagery and stories that were provided to us by some of the organizations that we worked with on the playbook. And we sort of said, you know, here's an example of what this image and what this caption is saying and what it could say to make it better. So for example, the first one, these are examples from Hunger Through My Lens, which is a program where people experiencing hunger took photos that represented, you know, how they're feeling and what they're thinking. And the first one is a picture of some bananas, and the caption is, "I took the photo of the beautiful bananas in a large chain supermarket in a nice neighborhood. And the other bananas, which were overripe and more expensive, were in a little corner bodega in a low-income neighborhood. It struck me that people living in poverty have no chance of eating nutritionally with that kind of disparity." And so one of the reasons why we thought this really worked, besides the fact that it's lifting up the voice of a person experiencing hunger, which is probably one of the most valuable things we can do. Why it works, it centers the image on hunger, displaying both the quality and the quantity components of the definition, making it easy to apply both metaphors. One of the things that could change is the caption could more explicitly connect the systemic barriers by fleshing out the connections to either the ecosystem or the power grid metaphor. So talking about how the cost of living has changed, talking about wages, talking about connecting it to some of the systemic changes that would impact the situation would be helpful, or talking about the power grid metaphor as patchy. So as a replacement for talking about food deserts, that's really what this is about, and, you know, putting it in a broader context. So that's one idea. The second one is a woman who wrote in the caption, "I have AIDS, and I've discovered that my medicine doesn't work if I'm not eating right. The driver's license photo on the left was taken September 2007 when I wasn't eating well. And the photo on the right was taken in August of last year. Look how much better I look when I'm eating well. Food feeds not just the body, but the soul." And this is a really powerful image and words. And the image in the caption clearly denotes the intersectionality of hunger and how the hunger connects to and is a symptom of systemic barriers to access. This image also elevates a personal lived experience that broadens the understanding of who experiences hunger. And, you know, ways that it could be changed or added to. The framing does perpetuate the understanding or the thinking that hunger is solvable by personal action, and could be improved by linking the structural or societal barriers that created the hunger experience. And obviously, when you're talking about someone's actual words, the ways in which you would change it would be, you know, around the framing of what they have to say. But we really love that campaign. And then there's another page here, which I'll leave for you to look at another time. And at the end, we have some tools and resources that we use a lot. And I've also have my information here at the end. But I wanted to find out if anybody had any questions or thoughts or ideas or criticisms. I used to have a professor that said thoughts, comments, criticisms. And feel free to unmute yourself. Mary, how can we get a copy? So I believe that April, maybe you can tell me. I've provided this presentation, the playbook, and the original messaging brief for anyone to have access to. So, but if Mary, if you want to email me, you can email me, and I will, unless I have your email here. Oh, thanks, Joshua. Joshua Garcia, I see you here. Thank you. You can download the playbook that way. And if you would like the original brief, I don't think the original brief is on our website, but if you email me, I can send you the whole thing. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Great. Well, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time, and we'd love to. You know, our mission is to help people integrate this. So whatever we can do. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for your comments.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, for sharing your expertise today. And thanks everyone for being here. If there are any questions or conversation that comes up after this session, feel free to post that in Whova. You can access that at any time by clicking View Session in the agenda. Or as Kristen said, you're also welcome to email her. Coming up next, we have a panel bringing together the vanguard of the anti-hunger movement. It's going to be great, so we look forward to seeing you there.